that was unveiled at a conference in Denmark in 2011, and it got mixed results. Flutter started life as something called Skia, running at 120 frames per second on Android. And one of the first people outside Google that bet their career on it, well, he's talking to us right now. Today, we're doing a full trip down memory lane, from Dart's controversial birth to Flutter becoming the most popular cross-platform framework on the planet. And we're doing it with someone who was there for almost all of it. Welcome, Brian Egan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you for many, many, many different reasons, right? Like we've been connected for years. I've told you many times, like how much I admire you as an engineer, as a member of the community, now as a colleague at Very Good Ventures. I learned Flutter watching your videos. We've talked about DartConf, right? Like 2018, that keys presentation that is magic. I share with a lot of people that is like, keep it simple state. And I think that was actually like a great topic for us to cover today, no DartConf, but like we're going to go back in, like down to kind of like dinosaurs, remember our memories. And let's start in 2011, because I don't think people realize that Dart was actually invented in 2011. There's a lot of people thinking that Dart and Flutter go hand by hand, which is true. But Dart is, at this point, like a very mature language. Do you remember anything about Dart in the early days?
Yeah, actually, I do. So I was working for Zappos at the time, and I saw when it came out, and they had released a couple of IDE plugins for IntelliJ and Eclipse, and so yeah, I actually installed. I used to use an editor called Aptana, which was an Eclipse variant back in the day, which I liked amongst using other editors at the time, like TextEdit and things like that. And so, yeah, it's funny. With Aptana, I had installed the plugin and started playing around with it. But I did think it was a pretty wild project to see if they could replace JavaScript as the default language with for the web. So yeah, I thought that was a pretty bold move, and as we can see, it didn't fully work out. But I thought there was like a lot of cool potential for Dart, so I had fun playing around with it back in the day.
It's crazy. And just to set the context, right? Like Dart was, of course, like created by the Google team, a few engineers in Denmark, and you still see like in Denmark, like how like there's a big like Dart team developing the language. But it is my understanding, I'm not a Google employee or anything like that, but this is based on conversations that they wanted to replace JavaScript. And the thing is, like, it makes sense. If we think about the web at that point, right? It's when like single page applications that are very highly interactive starting to be very popular. Like we have, I mean, of course, like the ad business for Google that is massive, but like for us as consumers, like Google Maps, Gmail, all those things back in the day were very disruptive, because within one single window in your browser, you were doing all these dynamic, fluid operations. The web didn't work like that. The web was like you go to a URL, it renders content, and that's what you get. So all of a sudden, you start seeing like a lot of JavaScript code being written. And one of the challenges with JavaScript is like, there's no types, right?
Yeah.
So what do you remember about Dart those days in terms of like syntax, like in terms of like learning the language? Did you feel like you had to learn like something completely new or different?
No. And so, what's interesting about the language, it was also basically worked on by the folks who actually invented Java as well, right? Gilad
Mhm.
Bracha was one of the main lead language designers at the time. And the idea was that the syntax was meant to be C-like and really easy, convenient, and convenient to learn for folks who were coming from JavaScript, Java, and other languages. And so I would say when I was first learning it, it actually felt really nice because I did like the idea of types. Coming into the language of JavaScript, I was working on, a team. We had about 15 or 20 other engineers working on various sections at Zappos. And there were definitely times, and there are still times, I think, if you're working on a JavaScript project, which doesn't use TypeScript, which I guess is taken over now, where, yeah, it's just like you're working on a bigger team and you're like, okay, how exactly does this work? And the only way to know is to like look at the function, see how it works, and see what data it actually returns. And so, yeah, I do think, especially as your team starts to grow, having the guarantees of type safety start to make more and more sense. So I that's why I actually was curious about the language and started playing with it at the time. And yeah, it was, and I still find this to this day, maybe because I'd played with it early on, but when I went from Android engineering, which I was doing at the time, over to Flutter, it's interesting. Dart wasn't the hard part, I don't think, at the time. Yeah.
There's a lot of people that will say that if you know Java or C# or even like JavaScript or any other like modern language, like congratulations, you know that. It's kind of like true. It's kind of like one of the guiding principles when it was created was familiarity. It's like, hey, like there's other languages that are more like disruptive, that the learning curve is very different, or it's just like that, like they take a different direction than like what the majority of the people are used to. And Dart is just one of those in which like you feel like as you type in your keyword, things will work.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I think it's a smart language choice. It's interesting because I think it's also similar to the other popular language from Google, which is Go, which I think has like what 24, 26 reserved keywords. Is a very simple language, and actually the idea behind Go as well is meant to be how do we get folks onto a new system, new language in as short a period of time as possible. That's one of the explicit goals, and I think it's a cool goal to try to achieve for sure.
I don't know if this is still happening like today, but like I think for a long, long time, Flutter, Dart, and Go, they were all reported in Google as part of the same structure, which I would imagine that there's a lot of like knowledge sharing, design that goes into the languages and all those things. Is there something, because of course, like 2011 until 2019, 20, something like that, it was like Dart 0 point or Dart point one, like 1.0. Is
Fun,
there
yeah.
something that you remember about the language those days that doesn't exist anymore? That was a big, big change.
I mean, of course, the new keyword going
The
away.
new
I think, I think,
keyword,
I
yeah,
think, especially for widget trees. Yeah, like that was probably one of the biggest ones because,
yeah,
like, yeah, like, I think there was I think that famous issue of like we should have JSX for Dart, like which turned into just like a total like probably the longest thread, maybe GitHub issue in Flutter repo history. I'd imagine it was very contentious, and so I do think it was great to remove that. Took inspiration from Kotlin and other languages which had gotten rid of it, and I do think that alone has cleaned up a lot of the the widget trees. For the better for sure. So I think it's funny. I think of all the like small quality of life changes, that was a massive one, and made readability a lot better. So I think probably new keyword going away is one of the top favorites for me. Yeah, and then like that's a big one. But also like I guess like true sound type safety
yeah,
is also maybe like that's not quality of life, that's like necessity, I think. And
yeah.
so
It's just like that
yeah.
is one of those that like probably if you were like really well organized and like diligent with your code, you could be like, oh, actually, I've been doing that. I just didn't need the compiler to help me, but now it helps me. But the new keywords, like especially in a widgets, are like you're building objects like pretty much every single line. So that
Yeah,
new keyword was getting quite annoying. Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
100%. Yeah.
I would lie if I said like I remember 2011 when that was released. That's the year that I moved to the US. I was more focused on a few other things. But I wonder if you remember what was the community reaction when that was released.
I think it's interesting. So I don't know, I guess it was interesting because I think the community, at least for me, was still a little more localized. So I
Mhm.
was really part of Vegas JS. I lived in Las Vegas at the time. That's where Zappos is based. And so we had like a fun group of folks there. And I do think all of us enjoyed playing around with it, or those of us who were interested in enjoyed playing around with it. But I think we all were very suspicious of it becoming a true web standard
Mhm.
and replacing JavaScript entirely, or how it even interop with JavaScript. Say you had like part of your, there was a lot of JavaScript in the world at that time, of course. So like say you have an application, it's not like Flutter where you can like add to app and like add Dart probably. Like, I don't know, what you have like two garbage collectors? Do you have one garbage collector? How would those interoperate? So I think that was always one of the biggest things. And then of course, like getting companies like Apple to ship it in Safari
Yeah.
or Firefox to adopt it and have to build their own interpreters and JIT and everything else. I do think that was a pretty bold move, I would say. And so I think it was a fun language, but I'm not too surprised with that being their initial goal, that it didn't quite go the way they wanted to. Whereas I think it's interesting because you look at TypeScript, and TypeScript, it's interesting because TypeScript almost follows like the kind of lineage of various compilers that compile Clojure or Ruby to Dart, right? And TypeScript is just like, hey, we're just going to add types to JavaScript, but it's still going to compile to JavaScript in the end. And I think those were more comfortable for folks because, there were already a lot of tools out there like Babel and others before that even that were trying to support ES6 syntax, but support IE6 still. So I think because of the way they positioned Dart, a lot of us in the community were like, cool language, don't think it's probably going to go anywhere. And even the Dart team, of course, had Dart 2.js back in the day. But I think even for us, we're just like, hey, we'll like, the tooling is pretty niche. The understanding in the community is pretty niche. So I think most of us were like, we'll stick to JavaScript for now.
Yeah,
At
and
that
even if
time.
you think, right, like they were trying to ship, which I think they did with Chromium, but never with Google Chrome. They were trying to ship and replace V8 with a Dart VM. And that was
Yeah.
kind of like what was going to kill JavaScript, which, I mean, I can understand why that was kind of like a North Star of like, let's try to shoot for the stars. And that seems like the ultimate step. But I think at that point, the web was such a like a big part of everybody's lives. And you have, whether it was like a standard or not, like at the end of the day, like you still had like maybe Chrome as a dominant player, but like Safari becoming very important now, even with mobile, right? And like we know that Safari on mobile, like for iPhone, you cannot ship any other like rendering engines or anything like that, right? So it became like kind of like, yeah, an interesting language. Something that like was heavily used probably inside Google. Again, like Google Ads, like I think probably is the biggest customer of that. But outside Google, there were like a few years that I think people forgot about Dart. But something happened, right? Uh, let's talk about 2016, 17, Eric Seidel and whatnot. What do you remember about those days?
So it's funny, I ended up reading maybe a Wired article or, one of those, like a Slashdot article, maybe Hacker News. On one of those sites, I was linked to an article about Sky and and like how they're like renaming it to Flutter. And I was like, yeah, I thought it was cool. So I was a few years into my Android career. So I started out more on the web side, writing PHP, Rails, and then various front ends as well, with JavaScript. And then especially at SoundCloud, I was working actually initially on their large backbone.js site, which is still run to this day, which is cool. But the writing was on the wall at that time. So I was there, I moved over there in 2013, and so by 2014, 2015, a lot of the questions weren't about like what we were going to add to the web, but it's like, hey, mobile's doing this, and then we'll bring it to the web maybe sometime. And so you're kind of like, maybe I should start writing Android and iOS apps more. I tinkered around with it. So for me, I kind of came from that Android background,
Mhm.
but no shade to the Android ecosystem. It just wasn't for me. Especially coming from web, I think the iteration cycles are just so fast. That's something I really missed, especially working on a larger app. At SoundCloud, we had 500,000 or 600,000 lines of code, and you know, it was before like all the cool Gradle optimizations and all this stuff that actually makes it a lot faster these days. And so, compilation was like sometimes for small changes, just to see a visual change was like 4 to 5 minutes. And it's kind of the classic XKCD, code's compiling and two people are messing around, right?
No, 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 no.
Yeah.
Don't our managers are watching. That never
Exactly.
happened.
Yeah, exactly. But you're like pair programming with someone and you're like, all right, so what do we do for 4 minutes? So yeah, it was, I think that's why I did struggle with the Android and
Mhm.
Java tool
Yeah.
chain. And so the one thing that they even promised really early on the day was hot reload and hot restart. And so that's where it really piqued my curiosity. And because I had tried or played around with Dart, like when it was first out, I was like, oh yeah, I remember that weird little language. Let me see what they're doing with it. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of how I got started. So I started just playing around. It was late 2016, maybe mid to late 2016. And then, yeah, I just kind of contacted Seth Ladd as well. I was like, hey, Seth, like he's a product manager on Flutter. I was like, this is pretty cool. And he's like, oh, that's fun. You should like come out to actually, was it like, is it like a Dart? Was it actually even, I don't even think it was Dart Conf. It was even smaller than Dart Conf, but it was like a little Dart Conf down in Munich, actually. So I headed down there for a couple of days and went to my first Dart event. Based out of the Google Munich office, and met with Seth and a few of the other folks. And I had started, writing a bit of open source, or I really don't think I'd published much at that time, but was mostly building apps and getting interested in it. And the performance was actually pretty fantastic for felt like such a fresh project, and it had hot reload, which I loved. So.
And I think it's important to understand what was the ecosystem back then, right? Because right now, this is 2026. The platform with Flutter, of course, with React Native seems very like approachable, model performant, right? So the choice is not about whether I'm gonna pay a penalty. Like the choices are a little bit different these days. But like back in 2016, 17, when Sky started to be a thing, like if you look at the landscape of like multi-platform choices, I've always said that at that point, someone, whether it was like your end customers, the organization, or developers, had to pay a penalty to go cross-platform. We know that like Facebook had a big effort to push HTML5, but HTML5 and like web technologies within the expectations of native performance, they just don't fit together. There were other approaches like PhoneGap, Cordova, in which like I think the end users like had to pay a penalty of like, oh, this doesn't feel premium. This doesn't feel well engineered. Maybe it worked really well for like, again, like in the field for B2B representatives, whatever. But like, you wouldn't imagine like your Pinterest, your Ubers to be built with a phone app or anything like that. And I think to me, when we saw like Sky, Flutter for the first time, it was like, oh wait, like here's a framework in which is going in the direction where like final users cannot tell the difference between a native app and a Flutter app. I remember doing at BMW like a user study because like we bet on Flutter very early on, and it was like a massive investment for the company. And we had this thing of like BMW being a luxury brand. What if our customers can tell that cross-platform is not premium? And we ran this like user study. 60% of the people in that user study, not engineers, just like customers, said that the Flutter application was more performant. I can tell you that frame by frame, they were both the same application, which meant like they couldn't tell. So now you have like a situation where like customers don't pay a penalty. Developers at that point, even though we had like the transition to Swift and Kotlin, they found like Dart and the tooling actually exciting, because like with hot reload, all of a sudden like your compilation cycles, development cycles are much faster. And then like the business unit, they're starting to realize that like, oh, we can unify roadmaps, invest more in innovation, on experimentation. So everything started to click. And that's why like some of these other frameworks like PhoneGap or whatever kind of like got pushed aside. And we're starting to see like the new two contenders that are like Flutter, React Native with more modern tooling, component systems and whatnot. Um, but yeah, still 2016, 17, 18, it was a big bet, I bet, for you even to just be like, hey, I've built my career as a like web dev, now Android, and Flutter was very niche. Tell me a little bit about like how did you learn the framework? How did you start like you said like hey, you were like start to do some open source contribution. Of course, you've created packages like Flutter Redux, like RxStar, Flutter sample architectures, Chewy. Tell me a little about those early days. Did you establish any relationship with Google? How did it go?
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to even remember what was that old chat program. I think it's like totally gone now. It's been replaced by Discord and others, but it was like that like engineer chat. It wasn't Slack. Anyways,
Keep check.
so yeah, there yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. So they had a few like channels like that. And so I was just joining those channels. And then for the most part, even back in the day, I mean, the Flutter team, they've always had extremely high standards for
Mhm.
documentation. So the API docs, even back then, were surprisingly good. And then, of course, just being an engineer, I would just go and read a lot of the code and see how it worked. Because, especially if you're trying to understand layout models and things like that, it's actually still something I tell folks all the time is like API docs are great. But just don't be afraid to jump into the source. It like looks wild. It's hard to read at first, but you do that enough and then you start to see like how things work and it starts to click and you can kind of like, okay, I'll just jump into this widget built by the Flutter team and okay, let me jump into like its corresponding element or render object and see how those are associated with this thing. And, I think it dispels a lot of the magic that's sort of going on under the hood. So for me, API docs were pretty much the key along with just reading code and then occasionally pinging the team when I was building stuff. So for example, probably my earliest open source contribution was a package called Flutter Stream Friends. So I was pretty interested, in, we were using reactive extensions RX, SoundCloud almost all the time for a lot of our operations. It was kind of a classic on Android. It was like hard to put things on the background thread. And so you'd like make it an RX and then you'd, send it to the background thread and then bring it back to the foreground thread. And it made it actually really easy to do a lot of those types of operations, even out of thread pool, everything else. And so that was really handy. And so between that and RxJS, there was like a library called CycleJS that I was interested in, which kind of inspired the MVI architecture. And there was even on the Android side, there was like a lot of blog posts around MVI architectures. And so
Oh, yeah,
that was
I
my
have a story
first.
for you in a minute.
Yeah, I'm happy
Yeah.
to hear it. So yeah, so that was my first thing was how I got into Flutter was kind of that way. And then with Flutter Stream Friends, I actually built something called a stream widget. And then I think Ian Hickson like took pity on me and he's like, all right, we have Future Builder, like your stream widget, which is like essentially a bad version of Stream Builder. He's like, okay, it kind of makes sense. Stream is like a core primitive in Dart. We have Future Builder already. Your stream widget's pretty whack, so I'll create Stream Builder. And then I actually that was my first contribution to the Flutter framework. Was making actually a couple of improvements to Stream Builder as well, especially around the initial value, because that is one of the interesting things about Stream Builder is you might need an initial value at some point. So that's kind of how I got into the open source community with Flutter and like kind of chatting with the team and learning the framework was just reading the docs and then starting to try to apply MVI architectures to Flutter to see how that would work. After kind of getting the basics of stateful, stateless, everything else.
That's great.
Inherited widgets. Yeah.
So one of the questions I think that might be interesting to answer is like we've been talking about how like the first demo that everybody saw is Skia, then like not Skia, Sky, sorry, that then was renamed to Fred and all the stuff was that it was very performant, right? Like we were like 120 FPS and all the stuff. And I think that that was a bold decision. Pretty much like what they did was to take Skia, right? And then turn it into like this main component. Can you tell us what Skia is and why it was so special for Flutter, especially in the early days? We know that it's no longer in the framework, but like what did it mean to have Skia? What was Skia back then?
Yeah. So Skia is essentially a 2D graphics rendering engine. And it's backed up by, I guess, a library called Ganesh, which is like OpenGL based, or initially written for OpenGL. And so, it was at the time just actually the 2D library that was also powering Chrome. And so that also probably is why they used it as well, right? Because a lot of the original authors of Sky came from the Chrome team, or from now Flutter came from the Chrome team. And so I think they saw and basically were building Skia at Google directly for Chrome, and it does an amazing job in so many ways. To be honest with you, like maybe it's tough to lead into as well with Impeller, but when I heard that they were going to implement their own engine, it's like, I don't know, man. If you look at some of the things they do with Skia, it's like you're talking about people who had like worked at like Sun Microsystems and Apple in like the 80s and have like extreme skill at like optimizing like vector path animations and things like that. Like, I mean, it is highly, highly optimized code in a lot of ways, for a lot of really interesting 2D use cases. And so I think that's part of the magic and the power. And it's interesting. That's actually the direction that React is taking now as well. They're actually replacing some of their rendering engines, which used to paint native code, native actual iOS and Android views with a Skia version now as well, because it's just such a powerful 2D rendering engine. So yeah, that's the heart of it. And yeah, it's interesting because even now Ganesh on the Skia side has been replaced by a newer API called Graphite under the hood. So it's also, to me, I'm like, oh, I wonder I wonder if like we can hook up Graphite and see how it compares to Impeller as well. I'm sure someone, Jonah Williams or someone on the Flutter team has done those types of that type
Yeah,
of
of course,
benchmark.
they're 2 steps ahead of everyone else. So
Yeah.
okay, so it seems like at that point we have some of the core components that like even power Flutter today, right? So before they even like call it Flutter and we go to the first alpha version, so we have Dart that had a little bit of visibility and exposure at the beginning, was intended to replace JavaScript, but didn't, and then like that energy kind of like got a little bit like watered down as time progressed. We have this experiment of Sky inside Flutter that it's not that they're building full apps. I think like the first one was just like a counter application or something like that. But they realized like, hey, these seem to be like a natural fit for how to solve mobile efficiency, modern tooling, and all those things. Do you know if before like even Flutter was Flutter, did they try different languages that wasn't Dart?
Yeah, so from what I understand, that they actually did try a few different languages. Ian Hickson, I don't remember if it was a blog post or a talk where he actually described, or maybe even just a GitHub issue again, where someone's like, "Why'd you guys use Dart?" And he kind of described that they went through a spike with Eric and a few others of essentially trying a few different languages, but they settled on Dart, I think, because of a few properties. First of all, it's garbage collector, its GC is really good for a lot of short-lived objects, and that was one of the main use cases for Flutter, right? You construct widget trees, you construct those objects, and then you need to dispose of them relatively rapidly. And so having a GC that wouldn't cause you to have garbage collection pauses, which are really common so with other languages, although frankly, I think like GCs are getting more and more advanced, and there's less of that in the world, but especially at the time. The other thing is, as you mentioned, they had the Dart team like on in Denmark, and they could work directly with the Dart team to tune the language in ways that were beneficial for Flutter in particular. So we're kind of joking around like, oh, thank God they got rid of the new keyword, but like qualities of life like that, it really does matter. And being able to like work on both the actual framework side, like the UI framework side, but then also be able to make language level changes and having a lot more control over that language level change. And of course now, I guess, you chatted previously, I think they were both maybe in separate parts of the organization, but they're, I think now, at least from what I understand, under one part of the organization or Google. So having that tight feedback loop as well, I think was a major selling point for them. But I know that they had tried JavaScript and a variety of other languages, but they found Dart was, at least according to their tests, like the best suited for their use case. So that's cool.
And then we're talking about hot reload, which applies to like mobile and all the stuff, but that introduces a separate way of compiling apps. What's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's actually probably also one of the important points to mention is the fact that they could do just-in-time compiling, or what you call JIT compiling, which is usually how V8 or any of your other browser JavaScript engines work. But then you get the benefits of ahead of time compiling or AOT compiling. So the great thing about JIT is that you can just run it, the language or the code gets interpreted and just runs. And that's actually what powers hot reload, of course. But then when you actually go to production, like you want to ship your code to a phone, especially back in the day, like you're dealing with like pretty underpowered Android devices. And like, iOS devices honestly weren't the most powerful at that time either. Although they're just absolute machines these days. And so you don't want to have like a really kind of slow startup speed, because that was definitely something that was, you talked about PhoneGap or Titanium or these other JavaScript frameworks. It was also one of the things that plagued them, is sometimes like you'd have really slow startup experiences. So being able to compile the code ahead of time um, to machine code is a really big advantage. And so that's what I think another massive property of Dart that they and why they went with that. Yeah, good question to also pump in there, because yeah, I think that's no doubt one of the main reasons that they chose the language. You get the benefits of just-in-time compiling for development cycles, fast hot reload, and then you get the users, the end users, of course, don't pay the price. So basically, it's kind of an everyone's win scenario in that situation,
Yeah.
because yeah, you get fast dev cycles and fast startup time and code execution.
And it seems like, so to situate ourselves in time, like this is almost like 2017, where like Sky is being rebranded as Flutter, but it seems like some of the major decisions were already made back then, that we're starting actually to see like the benefits and the rewards of those decisions immediately, like, and like they just kind of like surviving like the test of time really well, right? It's like this idea of like, we're gonna use Dart, we're gonna improve quality of life on the language, but it's gonna feel modern, it's gonna feel easy to learn. So if you know how to code in any other language, you should be like at home. They've invested a lot in like development tooling as well, so you can code in VS Code and IntelliJ platforms. I mean, today with MCPs and whatnot, like it's even like shifting that. Like pretty much like as a developer, you feel like, okay, I can just use whatever tools I know and I can deliver value with this. They pretty much got a stripped down version of Chrome that was just like the bare bones rendering engine, and they started to build Flutter on top of it. They introduced the widget system, and that's what made it like composable, efficient, like rich. Uh, those are decisions that probably they had made a different decision. Today, Flutter and Dart would be even something very, very different. But I remember back then, and that's where like I actually started to get myself involved into Flutter for many different reasons. Like there was a comment back then that it was like, these apps, they will never feel native. Like it's a different like rendering pipeline. So Android is one thing, iOS is one thing. How do you think that has played out, and like what did they do to try to fix that, and did they fix it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the people were right in a lot of ways. You could tell, especially, there was with Android, it was a little bit easier because it's an open source framework. You can just go look at the code and be like, okay, we need to implement, certain things this way or that way, because you can you can port the code pretty efficiently. But with something like iOS, especially around scroll physics, even honestly, they've kind of gone back and forth, even as recently as a couple of years ago, with like, okay, making sure that those scroll physics really feel good, and they're even making additional changes to it now. And I do think scrolling is, it's a fundamental action. So if it doesn't feel quite right, because that was actually something that, PhoneGap and other mobile frameworks were also doing, is they were trying to simulate those interactions in some ways as well. And those were also areas where you might think like, okay, it's pretty good, but if it's not quite right, I don't know. It is like one of those weird uncanny valleys that creates problems. And so, even at SuperList, we were where I worked previously, we were submitting actually pretty low level patches to some of those simulations and physics animations, because yeah, like you just really it just didn't feel good. And so yeah, like that's like a really important aspect, and I think it's like it's valid criticism. The other one, I guess, like, yeah, we can chat a bit about Impeller as well. As there was the shader compilation jank, as they called it earlier, which was that until you'd run animations and Skia had a chance to actually compile those, you might actually see the first run of some of your animations really drop in frame rate. And that's your first impression. If it's your first impression with someone, that's not, you want to make a really good first impression, especially if you're, uh, a framework that's meant to kind of allow folks to be really creative with their designs. And so I do think a lot of those different types of things were totally valid criticism. And, yeah, like with every tech decision or every engineering decision, there's pros and cons, and I think this is where they ran into some of the cons of their decision. But yeah, overall, I think the pros of that are pretty great as well, which is you can write a design system and it works really well across both platforms. It really reduces your time to ship. So one thing we had constantly at a company like SoundCloud or even before at Zappos was your iOS and Android teams, they're on different cadences. Certain things are easier on one platform or another. How do you actually ship to all those platforms at the same time? Well, a lot of times what you do is, frankly, you ship it to either iOS or Android earlier than the other. You put it behind a feature flag, and then when everyone's ready, you do a big marketing release. But with Flutter, you don't have that kind of problem. And so that's I think like where it's always important to think about pros and cons and trade-offs that you're making. And yeah, I do think, I don't know if you felt the same way or had the same experiences,
Oh,
but yeah, I definitely think there were definitely times where you could feel it, and I'm glad that they keep making more and more progress to remove that friction.
it's funny because I think despite of having worked in the user interface space for like, I don't know, like 20 years or whatever, there's like nuances that are still like, I don't catch with my eye. Maybe I don't have like that taste or that vision. But I remember vividly, March of 2018, at BMW, we started to experiment and seriously consider like different options, and Flutter was a contender. And I took 1 week of vacation. I went on a ski trip with a few friends that are like Spanish, live in the US, they're engineers. And one of those friends, she's an engineer on Instagram working on the scroll views in the main feed. So probably like when it comes to like world talent, is one of the top 5 engineers in the world looking at like recycler views, collector views, and whatever, like list views and whatnot. And I remember like we're going on the lift to the top of the mountain. The lift got stuck. In just 2 hours, she was just telling me every single thing that was wrong with like list views and scroll views in Flutter because she had tested out. So like this is not up to Instagram standards. And it's funny because like she was true, but at the same time, then we did like experiments with users, and a lot of people didn't even notice, right? Like sometimes what you realize is like based on your experience, expertise, you put like the focus in different areas. As an organization, when you make your tech choices, like you also like try to kind of like balance different constraints, opportunities that you might have in the business. Again, this is 2017, 18. It was a very different framework back then, but like I just remember that one vividly.
Yeah, no, I mean, even at SuperList,
Yeah.
actually. So we had this incredible engineer, Mate Nap, and I think we might even chat about some of his work
Mhm.
ahead as well. But we had problems with SliverList. Actually, it wasn't fast enough to handle some of the use cases we were dealing with, especially. We had a lot of very long lists, very large pages with very dynamically sized elements, and it just wasn't handling that. So we actually even gave him some time, and he spent 2 to 4 weeks rewriting SliverList from scratch, and we created something called Super SliverList, and it solved a lot of our scrolling problems for sure. And actually, even to this day, you can go to like the Super SliverList repo and like look at it compared to SliverList, and it was hilarious. I mean, he was like, we were comparing it to like Swift UI and all like the latest and greatest from even Apple and Android, and it's like it's really good. It's really good. It has a couple of interesting layout issues here and there, um, like a couple of quirks, I would say, because in order to get that performance, you have to make some assumptions. But it's actually, yeah, and yeah, it's scrolling is a surprisingly hard problem, for sure.
All right, so let's go to early 2018 and DarkConf. Um, was that in LA?
Yeah, exactly. That was in
Nice.
LA.
Did you feel in that event that you were starting to witness something that was about to explode?
So yeah, so when I went to, as I mentioned before, I'd gone to a Dart conf in Munich, and it was like in the basement of like a Google office, essentially, with like, I don't know, maybe 50 to 80 people or something. It was super tiny. And it really was not, it was not the most like, it was a fun event, but it felt very like almost like a small like meetup or something.
Mhm.
And it was mostly Googlers who were there. Um, I can't remember if that was late 2016 or early 2017, along that timeline. I'd have to like go back and check my flights. But then going to StarConf in 2018, it was, in this like totally different, it was a totally different scale at that point. You had community members, way more folks from different companies than I'd seen at the conference in Munich. The actual production was like quality had gone through the roof. I mean, it was, you could really tell something was changing with Flutter. And that, going from DartConf to really the first conference where I think where Flutter became a big deal. Yeah, it was one you could really feel like a big step change at that point for sure.
What motivated you to like? There's like this talk that you gave there that is like keep it simple state, right? Like a reference to like keep it simple stupid. Uh didn't say that in a podcast. No, I'm joking. Um but to me like that one is almost of a revelation because at that point like it was a very like beginning type of community. Architecting Flutter apps like probably wasn't in that many people's head at that point. Like as you said, like some of these widgets are very early on. How do you compose? How do you scope? Like I think your that talk is very robust, not only for only 2018, for 2026. Like it sets the standards of like how to pass a state in your application, how to scope state and dependencies properly. What light did turn on in your head to create that one, and how was that experience?
Yeah. So I think that was almost like directly out of my background based in web and Android. One of my colleagues at SoundCloud, basically the engineer who taught me how to write good Android code, his name is Guillaume Loom, great guy. And so we just had like a really interesting collaborative relationship where he was actually really interested in JavaScript architectures, and I was really interested in learning Android architectures as well. And so at the time, MVP was the big deal in Android, and SoundCloud had some screens that were what they used to call God activities back in the day that just did everything in one gigantic class. And the team had done a great job refactoring over to MVP and clean architecture. And so, for me, that was the first time I'd worked on, I guess, a front end application using clean architecture. Our back end applications used many of those principles as well, but I thought it was a really interesting sort of thing. Um, but at the same time, I didn't, I think the composability of Android's a bit rougher than something like React. The reason React was such a revelation for the JavaScript community was, we had some of that even with Backbone of like composing different, what you call Backbone views together in that way, but really React components kind of took that to the next level. And that's what Flutter widgets are directly inspired by React components, right? And so I had just been lucky enough to sort of work in an ecosystem with strong typing, with clean architecture, and in an ecosystem where React was becoming a big deal and dealing with a lot of those things. And so for me, it was kind of almost a combination of all of my discussions with Guillaume and all my learnings on both of those platforms for writing UI code across different types of ecosystems. And so for me, it was kind of my synthesis of everything I felt like I had learned by porting essentially both Android and JavaScript frameworks to Flutter, and then like throwing all this spaghetti at the wall, which became the Flutter architecture samples, where I put all these different things together. And it was sort of my like mental synthesis of my thoughts, having gone through all those different experiments, from working on Redux to RX Dart to MVP to MBI, and then that's where even like Bloc was introduced. Not Flutter, or not the current way we know it as the Bloc
Yeah,
library,
no, it's
but
the Google version of Bloc.
the
Yeah.
Google version of Bloc. Yeah, exactly. Was even introduced at that conference, and so yeah, really kind of interesting. so that was sort of that's where that kind of came from, was my sort of synthesis of these different ideas at the time. And yeah, it's funny. I think I do think like I think I've seen some comments on that, like that YouTube are like, this is pretty dense, man. And like, yeah, it was a lot of content for a 27-minute talk. Yeah, for sure. But I was trying to get a lot out in 30 minutes, for sure.
I think probably half of the views that you have on that video, they're coming from me or for people that I told and asked to watch that video.
Nice.
And the reason for that is because I think that like I'm a big believer of like the following. That sounds easy to say, but really hard to do. That is like the only way to make progress is that for complex problems, you need to provide easy solutions. Like the abstraction needs to be right, so when you build on top of it, it doesn't show its cracks in the foundation. And I think that's the first one that I saw. Like, okay, I see a lot of theory about Flutter state management. State management back then wasn't even like what it is today. There was no Flutter block. Uh, the Google pattern was still being introduced. Observable, like reactive programming was still being developed in React. So we had like a few things, like we have inherited models, set state. I think at that point you had release scope model. But I didn't want to tell people how to think about state while thinking about the tooling, because then it's hard to separate those two. And what I like about that talk that you had is like, no, state is independent of the tooling. So good architecture, good separation of concerns can be achieved regardless of the tooling. And then the tooling is almost like personal taste. And I think that that to me is very, very powerful. 2018 was a very special year. I think for me personally, for many different reasons. But one of them, I think it's like VGB was created in April full of 2018. David, great day to start a company. But I know that the team had already started working on Hamilton. It was kind of like the first commercial application using Flutter that achieved a certain degree of success and scale. I love that in the Flutter documentation, you can see references to Hamilton all over the place. Every time I look at it, like it
Yeah.
puts a smile on my face. That's what at BMW personally, we started to experiment with Flutter. And I was telling you before, like I was laughing at model view intent because that was kind of like this part that helped Felix to create Flutter Bloc. I always love telling the story of like at BMW initially, we didn't want to use Flutter. And I have a question for you related to this, but pretty much what happened there is like we create like an internal team of iOS devs, Android devs, and web devs to figure out like, okay, what's gonna be the future of digital experiences for BMW, Mini Rolls Royce. But we all had this identity pride that is like, I'm an Android developer, I'm an iOS developer, and we didn't want to give up that version of ourselves. Like in my case, I was already going to conferences, developing a little bit of a public persona. So my ego got in the way of like choosing the right tech. And for a while, we decided to use Uber Rips that I actually shared with you yesterday. It's like, oh yeah, we have the same architecture for everything, so we can share the roadmap. Uh, but then our CTO said, like, that's great, and I love Rips, but the reality is that the company is not going to invest the same way on Android and iOS for many different reasons. What can we do on the technology side? And we start to realize that the same principles that we loved about Rips, you could have them with Flutter. That is like modern tooling, great separation of concerns, robust architecture, and then like hot reload, blah, 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 and all those things. And I remember like at that point is when Felix joined the team, and my Android team had been working in a library called Circuit that was like an adaptation of MBI. He saw that, and the day after, he's like, I got it. And that's how I introduced like Flutter Block is like this idea of like a state machine where like you have events, they trigger states and all the stuff. Yeah, 2018, the year of very good ventures, Flutter going to alpha, Flutter Block. I think that there's a lot of people that they forget that that happened there. And then we continue progressing. I want to kind of like touch base a little bit on like 2019 and 2020. Because during that time, we got like Flutter. It was like the event in London. I don't remember the name, but I think that's why they announced actually the first. I don't know if you remember
Was that
Hummingbird.
Flutter Live?
Flutter Life, yeah. Flutter
Yeah,
Life
yeah.
in London. Do you remember Hummingbird?
Sorry?
Hummingbird? Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's when they released like the first kind of like prototype of Flutter Web. And I just remember those days as magical, like the energy in the community. Like I remember then there was like after London, this other event in New York, Flutter Interact, and then like Flutter Europe. How do you remember those days? What was the vibe in the community?
That was like such a fun time, right? Because yeah, I mean, it's the kind of classic thing where like you're like I was into this band before it was cool, sort of a thing, and like I don't want to come across like that, but that's kind of how it was, right? It was like a small community of folks. I think like that's when we first started hanging out at conferences and just getting to know each other as well. And that's what's nice about smaller communities as well, is it is more personal on that side. And so people I was living in Berlin at the time, when I worked at SoundCloud and started working on Flutter, and like a lot of the folks from Flutter Berlin are folks I ended up working with at other companies, and you just get to know folks, because it's a bit easier and a bit smaller in that way. And so yeah, and so I think it was just a great time on the community side as well. And I think it was, the other nice thing about being in early is, like someone like myself, I wasn't like a genius. I just like went to like NPM is like one of the top 10 most important packages for React. And I just started porting them, and like, and so like you kind of have those opportunities as well, just to, like I said, like throw spaghetti at the wall because it's just not even there. I mean, and so that was like just a bit of fun as well. And so, I think it was really an interesting time as well, because then, well, like there was a lot of questions to answer and a lot of questions to chat through. For example, one of the things I was always like probably like begging the Flutter team is like, if, for example, I think they started talking about like Hummingbird and like desktop support. I'm like, man, there's really not a good database implementation for SQLite in the community. And that is so important. Like, I don't know, before you guys spread out to like 5 other platforms, maybe we could should we like focus on some of those fundamentals? And luckily I think we've got a lot of really good community options for that. So the Flutter team was right. Their strategy was right in the end, focusing on the like enabling multi-platform and allowing the community to fill in on that stuff. But I think, like I said, there was just so many problems to solve, that it was a lot of fun to kind of get together with people and chat through like, oh, what pain points are you feeling? Like, what's missing? Yeah. So good times for
And I
sure.
think sometimes what we don't realize is how much the Flutter team and the Dart team they've been able to accomplish with a relatively small and lean team. It's not like a huge division inside Google. Like this is an open source project that for them it's an enabler and whatnot. But like it's not that they have 1,000 people working on this 24/7, right? Like I think actually probably the Flutter team has never passed like 50 or 60 people, something like that, which for like all the complexities that go into this project, to me personally is very impressive. And I think that they have always understood what's their mission and their position in the community, and what is the opportunity for the community as well. All right, so 2020, we're gonna skip that year. We were all at home, blah blah blah. Actually, no, a lot of things, very important things, happen in the Flutter community, because as we start getting ready for 2021, they drop like a early access preview type of thing where like all of a sudden your types, they're no longer just like types that can't or can't be. We get null safety, which is another revolution that was very easy to adopt. You remember those days?
Yeah. No, I mean, that was a great decision. I'm glad we got sound types with full null safety. Because yeah, it's just it's a classic foot gun, right? As they call it, the $1 billion problem. And it's true. So no, I'm so glad that they made that decision, and that was a big effort. And I think they made it at the right time. I don't think Dart was huge at that time. Like I think doing something of that scale now would be it was already I maintained several open source libraries. It was a lot of work to migrate. It would be exponentially harder to get a community to migrate now.
I do think, because I've seen, for example, the jump on the Java side to Kotlin side and all the stuff. And of course, like the dimensions were bigger, but like sometimes it's not about the dimension, it's like how you think, or like how the framework forces you to think about your APIs in a certain way and all those things. And to me, one of the things that was very impressive is that Dart has always had really good migration tooling. Um, Either where it helps you to spot the issue and it's relatively easy to fix, or either because they incorporate like auto fix commands that based on like LinkedIn and analysis services gets there. Like I remember, I don't know, like as a consultant, like a big chunk of work many, many times is legacy modernization. And for Android apps to Kotlin, man, like they were like straight like years of business coming out of that. And for like null safety migrations, it was like, oh yeah, we can get it done in like a week, in 10 days or whatever. And I'm like, that to me was the real revolution. It's like, okay, the system is already kind of like forcing you to develop your apps, your programs in a certain way, but then the tooling that they incorporate is so robust, strong, and efficient that it just like helps you to get there. And like you just had to see like the quality of kind of like what was on Dev. If it had been so hard, like a lot of like big packages would have like just take longer and longer. It was a relatively simple transition in the community for such a big, impactful change.
No, it was impressive, and it actually, yeah, it really directly inspired me. So, yeah, I did a lot of work on RX Start. So shout out to Frank Peppermans who actually kicked that project off. And we worked together to sort of migrate that library, not only for null safety, but then also for extension methods when they came out. Originally, in order to use RX, you have to like wrap every stream you had into an observable, and then you'd have access to all the methods. Or you could, if you wanted to, use the underlying stream transformers directly by being like stream.transform flat map, but of course it just looks horrific. And so, yeah, and so it was interesting because, like you said, they had a lot of developer tooling out there, and they had a really cool little CLI that they published that you could make your own CLI for. So when we did the transition even to extension methods, I just was able to build a pretty easy CLI with their tooling, and people could run that and migrate from the old way to the new way, and pretty easily as well. Yeah, so I agree. I think a surprisingly seamless transition is still, still some work to do, especially like you said, if you'd made some questionable decisions with dynamic in a few areas or done other things like that. But yeah, you had to think through things a little bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, it was a good one.
I also think that that time, as we kind of like start that like null safety era, we've removed the new keyword from Dart. All of a sudden, the language, like it's very efficient and economic to use. And it's becoming to be like a real contender, not just for like your front end applications with Flutter, right? Like we're starting to see some like incursions and even like companies being created on the cloud side of the side, like, oh, if I'm using Dart for my front end, can I use it on the back end as well, right? Like I think right around that time is when like at VGB we started thinking about Dartfrog, like the server pod people started to come up. But to me, those days is when it truly shines as multi-platform, multi-device that is not just mobile. Because many times when we think about multi-platform, people will think like it's iOS and Android. But that's the year that actually Toyota made the bet, a big bet of like, what if we put Flutter in a car? And that question that is just like 4 words, it's a effing huge effort. I don't know if people realize how much effort goes into developing an infotainment system for a vehicle. It's years of development. It's multiple cycles. It's not the most powerful hardware. And then on top of that, like security and compliance is like top of the top. And it varies per region. You don't have the same compliance and checks and whatnot in Europe than in the US, than in Canada, than in China. So the permutations are immense. And to me, Toyota betting on Flutter was almost like this moment of like, and not betting just for mobile. It's like, oh, they are, first of all, willing to invest in the ecosystem because they're going to put it in a vehicle. So they're going to have to make changes to the engine, to like all the bindings with the native layers and all the stuff. And that to me was like the kickoff of like, okay, Flutter is here not just to be like a mobile framework, it's here to be a front end toolkit that is truly portable anywhere where there's a screen. I love saying that if you want to build an app for the Madison Square Garden Jumbotron, now you can do it. And that to me, we were talking before about like these identity things, like, oh, I'm an Android developer, I'm a Flutter developer. Since then, I started saying, and kind of like coaching even our teams, like, started saying that we're just a product developer. That you think of a digital experience, and independent of the operating system and the layer behind it, you can build it there. Were you surprised about hearing about Toyota and all the potential that the ecosystem of Flutter open up?
Yeah, I think it's a really cool use case just to be like, we're going to embed this directly. We're going to, yeah, I think it's an amazing use case overall. And I'm not sure, it's funny. I think LG's gone a little bit quiet, but I know that they were or are working on a transition as well, from WebOS, which is kind of an amazing old operating system, right? That Palm invented, back in the day, when they still had phones, and that was ported to TV, and now they've even I think started making their migration over to Flutter as well, and that's incredible. You can just hopefully write Flutter apps directly for these platforms, and yeah, like you said, they're efficient enough because of some of the topics we've talked about. You have AOT compiling, ahead of time compiling. You get really good performance. The garbage collector is still really good, even on low power devices. So, for example, if you're powering a Toyota dashboard, you don't want like your speedometer to be jittery or something like that. That's
Yes.
literally dangerous, right? So the fact that you can actually embed it just directly into a Linux system and just run with it, it's so cool for sure. And I think that's the portability of Flutter is a really interesting, really key selling point to it as a technology. And I had to your point as well. I mean, I had written some like toy desktop applications for Mac OS, on Windows way back
I
in the
wouldn't say
day.
SuperList was a toy application.
Yeah, exactly. But then with SuperList, we went all in on Flutter, and to be honest with you, like that was actually the CTO before I joined SuperList. He's like, we're doing this, and it's a super bold move in a way because it really was not ready for prime time when they started, but yeah, with help from Mate and our engineers at SuperList, we actually did a lot of work on the engine itself, and then pushing the package ecosystem forward as well. And so, I think it's fair to say I learned a ton about writing Mac OS applications just doing that. And so, yeah, it's an interesting one. And, eventually we had it running on web as well, and really worked with Kevin Moore directly on the WASM integration. And shout out to him and the team that worked on that, because they were so responsive to issues that we were having, performance issues. I mean, directly we'd like report bugs. So we literally ran Flutter master. We weren't on any Flutter stable at
YOLO.
SuperList. We were on Flutter's master almost all the time, because we were just contributing different things, and needed those like latest and greatest fixes. Although, it sometimes came back to bite us as well, as Flutter master will. But I think that's what is a cool one. Like to your point about like, okay, you kind of go beyond just like, I'm a mobile engineer, but you really can think like, okay, all these different platforms, and you really do gain experience with all of them as well. Because web, for example, we had a web app running on WASM, but it's like, okay, how do we make sure our database is actually performant on web? Like, what technologies can we use to back it up? And all of these types of questions are still really interesting. You also run into different security problems on web versus other platforms like like CSRF tokens and other XSS type of attacks. So, it's cool because it's almost like a gateway to learn about these different platforms, and then to take it as far as Toyota is just that's so cool.
Yeah. And today we live in the world with like Flutter 3, right? Like Dart has been highly optimized for like user interfaces, the way you work with collections, like the number of operators that you have access to has changed. There was like a big push that I know that the team had to back down a little bit, like with like macros and what that would mean for the Dart ecosystem. Although I think that, well, it is said that macros couldn't like turn into a real thing. I think that the learnings coming out of that exercise are still gonna benefit immensely the community, right? Uh, and then the thing that powered Flutter at the very beginning, we talk a little bit about this, is Skia. that was kind of like the rendering engine of Flutter, got totally pushed aside. The Flutter team brought like Impeller for like all the places. I don't know about you. I didn't have to change a single line of code in any of the projects. And to me, like that's almost like magical. Like, how can you make such a drastic change and just get the benefit out of it and barely anything else?
I do love the Flutter team. We actually did. We
Okay.
actually did have to. We had to like, especially so we were using Flutter SVG.
Oh yeah. Well.
And that is like I was chatting about when I was kind of chatting earlier about how they had incredibly well optimized like
Yeah.
rendering paths in Skia. We did. I mean, like the Flutter team is super cool though, and so we did work with them directly to make actually like a bunch of improvements, and then they made a bunch of improvements as well in that area. So, like I said, we were on master, so we were we were maybe a little bit ahead of the game, and we were aggressively trying it because we did see a lot of initial startup jank with Skia, so it was something we really wanted to migrate towards. And so I think because we were living on the edge, on the bleeding edge, we did experience a few bumps along the road. But I agree. I think like if you were just upgrading from one to the next, you're doing a lot of pretty standard things, like you're probably you aren't gonna run into many problems. Like I think like you've talked about earlier. I think they do a great job of actually introducing, essentially breaking or pretty important changes without making it too burdensome to the developer community as well. And they also had nice opt-in, opt-outs, right? So if we were running into performance issues, we would just opt out for a couple of months until like some of the fixes we were working on or working on the Flutter team with were introduced. And then, yeah, it was a really nice working relationship. I really, I think the Flutter team does a really fantastic job to responding to feedback and making a lot of like pretty impressive performance optimizations.
I'm gonna ask you about the last question in this time. Right? There's a lot of like big topics that we haven't even just touched, right? Because we've been talking about uh like some other stuff, but like one thing that I don't think we're gonna have time to cover today, but like Flock when became a thing, like create like a big noise in the community, all the stuff. I want to put that aside, but I want to ask you because we learned a little bit at the end of the year, and it's gonna be a big change coming up in 2026 that in order to move faster when adopting like new design systems like Material and Cupertino, they've been part of the core Flutter SDK since the very early days. And now they're going to be decoupling Material and Cupertino into their own separate libraries, right? So any opinionated UI toolkit, whether it's kind of like official by a operating system or just like your branding and all the stuff, it should be easier to develop and adopt and whatnot. What do you think the opportunities, especially for us, like that we kind of like spend our day to day building apps, helping companies to adopt their branding, that creates for us, or like any other like challenges or headaches? Because this seems to be kind of like part of the evolution of this year. Like there's going to be a big emphasis on like widget like system, like design system catalogs, UI, like Gen UI and things like that, right? Like your UI layer is going to be even more important than ever in 2026.
Yeah. No, I mean, I really like it. I think overall it's one thing we struggled with. At SuperList, we had a completely, bespoke design system. I'm sure you've worked on tons of design systems as well. But it can be tough to get away from the material components because they just have a lot of really important functionality baked into them. But then on top of that, they have baked in a lot of really opinionated design choices. And so that was one thing that we had to spend quite a bit of time doing. Is it sounds silly, but you have to make like a good button. Unfortunately, takes like a surprising amount of work.
Yeah.
As silly as that is, it sounds. Like sure you can create like a decorated box and then throw a semantics widget over it and do a few other things, but then like, all right, how do you like handle all the various states and the combinations of states, and all these different types of things, and from like focus to active to all those types of states that you can handle, that just like it actually becomes like, okay, that's like a button, let alone getting to like more complex interactions or more complex design components. And so I am really hopeful for a couple of things. Like first of all, that your Flutter upgrades aren't tied to changes to material design. I think that's great because especially if they like make breaking changes to material design, but you don't really care, it just creates work for you. Whereas like if the old version's working fine, okay, I want to upgrade Flutter. For us, like I said, we need these impeller rendering engine changes, or we need like the latest and greatest from Wasm. But along with that, now we have to like also upgrade our material design widgets. It actually created a coupling between the design system and the core components that causes friction. So I love the fact that they're unbundling these things. Um, and so I'm a big proponent. And then I do hope, I'll be interested to see where their efforts go with potentially creating like a base layer or base abstraction for some of these components. Maybe they can't even do it. I mean, there are pretty drastic differences between material and other design systems where maybe that's even hard to sort of model
Mhm.
from from a component library, and that's where the community I think can step in and help out. So you already see some of that effort, right, with what is it, like Shade UI, and other component systems like that. And yeah, and that's essentially what we eventually ended up doing ourselves. And so, taking away some of that friction like that is like we chatted about earlier. One of the great things about Flutter is you can really bake your own design system. And I think making that even easier and easier just gives you like the power as a brand, or for us as a consultancy, to help brands really express themselves and their design languages with Flutter without like, okay, we're just going to like kind of style some material components or something like that, which doesn't always look right on iOS or Android, vice versa. So no, that's the coolest part. So I'm a big fan of that. Overall, a
That's
big
great.
big fan. Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of like anxiety in the developer ecosystem because like the new tooling and this or that. But I honestly believe that there's never been a better time than today to become a product engineer, a product developer. So that's very exciting. And like, I mean, there's many other frameworks that are great these days, right? But I think Flutter is a solid choice for anything that you need that needs to live on a screen. So that's great. Brian, we're gonna do our special section of the Very Good Engineering YouTube series. We call it the lightning round. Are you ready?
All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do
Actually,
it.
I specifically didn't like look at any of these questions, so I'm excited to try them out. Yeah,
Nice,
exactly.
nice. All right. First question. Favorite Flutter packets that you didn't build?
Um, oh man, there's tons, but I have to give it to my favorite package, Drift, which is a database
Solid choice.
SQLite yeah package. Man, author is just a super nice guy, and he has done an amazing job.
Yeah.
So Drift. Yeah.
And as you said, it's not an easy problem to solve.
No, and it handles web, all the platforms super well. Has amazing generation, so you can write SQL files or .drift files, and it generates Dart. Oh man, but it's like there's so many things I could just gush about that library. Yeah.
All right, folks. If you haven't tried Drift, now you know it has the Brian Egan stamp. All right. Second question. Most underrated feature of the Dart language.
Most underrated feature of the Dart language. Um, it's funny. I think like I don't know, maybe just record types. I don't even know if it's underrated. I do love record types for a lot of like simple cases. I'm still hoping for proper data classes. I do hope like I don't know. I know the macros didn't quite work out, but I do hope they bring Dart data classes to Dart so we can get proper copy within other types of methods. But records are also really fantastic for all sorts of use cases. I don't know if it's underrated or not. For a really weird one, I don't know, one of my favorite things for serialization is using converter and codec classes. I don't think anyone knows that those exist, but you can, they're there. Maybe go check them out, just see if you have some fun with them. Yeah.
Nice. Talking about data classes, with the recording that I did with Joanna, our good colleague Jamie Kerber, she's releasing a package called Chrysalis. We should check it out because she told me that she's probably gonna be solving this idea of data classes in a very elegant way, and that can I put a smile on my face. So I gotta
Nice.
check it
Yeah.
out. All right, third question. The state management approach you'd use if you had to start an application from scratch today.
Yeah. Yeah, this is going to sound crazy, but I mean, I think you need to go with a layered architecture. So I think the important thing to note about state management is, in my opinion, it's the way that you glue your business logic and your data logic to your view layer. That's sort of where I see state management living. I I'm not sure if I'm just an old man at this point, but I love Provider. I think it's great. I think Provider with either ValueNotifier or ChangeNotifier are still just are fantastic. Like you can go really so far with those. They're simple. Yeah, I think they make you think about the right questions. So, for example, if you're having a provider not found exception, yes, you might need to move it above your route, but that also is a good opportunity to think about why you're moving that thing
Yeah,
above your route, whether that's the right thing to do, whether it's the wrong thing to do. So, yeah. And the fact that it mimics the graph structure of a widget tree,
big
I
time.
think is great as well. So, yeah, I think provider change notifier
Yeah,
or
I
value
think
notifier.
historically one of the challenges with state management is like I've seen people trying to do way more things than just state management with a state management solution. And that's what like gets complicated and complex. And sometimes we don't even have the same language when talking about a different problem. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I like, if I make like one other point there is like, I love the state management topic. I chatted about it, of course, I've had talks about it. But like the other thing to note is like for beginners, like it can be a tricky topic, but like the most interesting and the most advanced things you'll do are not state management. It really is
I
in the
wish.
business, in the data layer. Like that's where you're going to run into like, that's where the demons actually are. That's where like the fun stuff actually is, or even like, how do we embed Linux onto a Toyota, platform like that? There's so many interesting problems. So like, don't get too hung up on it. If you have something that works and works well, just go for it.
Absolutely. All right. Hottest take you have about Flutter that would get you in trouble?
Hottest take that would get me in trouble. Oh, that's interesting. That would get me in trouble. Well, I guess maybe kind of related to the last one is like, I think one of my favorite blog posts from my previous colleague, Iro Kranka, is all if all you had was scope model, you'd still be fine. And I think that's basically true. And so yeah. Like I don't know, we did all these things, we spent years doing it, and I think that's still like a hot take. I don't know if it will get me in trouble. I don't mean to like I think like Riverpod, Get It, all these are really cool libraries, really well done. But yeah, I think like you don't need to overthink it. And then I think getting me in trouble. Yeah, if we're going to talk about Flock, I don't think that was the best thing overall either. Like, I think the Flutter team took it well and responded to feedback more effectively. But I do wish that project would have gone a little further than it did. If they were going to make, I feel like it made kind of more of a, it brought more bad vibes to the community than I think it brought value in the end.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I know the people involved with that. I don't mean to like call them out directly. Like they're great engineers. Matt Carroll's a fantastic engineer, but yeah, I don't think that was the healthiest thing for the community as well.
I echo that. I hear you. One thing from the Flutter early days that you're glad didn't survive.
I think Redux is pretty well dead at this point. I don't know if too many people use it, so I think that was the right choice. Like I don't know, it was a good experiment, it was a good try. Yeah, I think it was worth bringing it over, but I think Redux is pretty much dead in JavaScript land. I think it's pretty much dead in Flutter land.
I have
So,
an article that will haunt me forever. Like in the early days of Flutter, we were trying it at BMW, and we were experimenting with state machines and all the stuff. And I was like, ooh, Redux is great because like it gives you this idea of a state machine, blah, blah, blah. But then like if you put it everywhere, even for your like local ephemeral states, then it's too much. So I wrote this article of like, you should use Bloc for your local and ephemeral states and mix it with Redux on top of it.
oh, I
It's one
remember
of
that. I
those that
remember
at the
that.
point
Yeah.
I thought it was brilliant. Now with the past of time, like no, let's solidify on one solution, like consolidate APIs, blah blah blah. But that one got a lot of visibility in the Flutter community. Simon put it like even in the Flutter community, Medium, and all that stuff. And I think it gave me a lot of visibility and recognition in the community. But if I could go back in time and be like, update, I regret saying these words, I would totally do it.
Yeah. No, I mean, my biggest thing is I've just never seen two Redux. It's like, oh, it's a really simple concept. I've never seen a team use it. I think the way it was intended to be used, and it just gets messy every time. So, yeah, we can leave that one in the past. It was a good try. But yeah.
All right. And the last question of the lightning round. If you could go back to DartConf 2018 and tell yourself one thing about where Flutter would be in 2026, what would it be?
I think It's an interesting one. Yeah, in 2026, I think, it's a funny one because I think like overall, a lot of the architecture stuff that I was thinking about is still pretty relevant, right? Layered architectures. I don't think there's a lot of stuff to change there. But I do think I would like tell myself to like support the multi-platform a bit more. Like I said, I was pretty skeptical of going on
Same.
the desktop and other areas. Even web, I will be honest, even web, maybe that's the hot take I should have said is like, for the most part, if you're just building a web app, use web technologies, don't use Flutter. But I think the Flutter team has done an amazing job of actually, especially with WASM compilation, it's gotten really good. So yeah, embrace it. The community will make up for the holes in the package ecosystem. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Brian, we got to the end. I don't know about you. I had a blast. I feel like I could be talking to you for 4 hours. It's getting close to coffee time, beer time. So next time, maybe but I don't want to do of anything, but I just wanted to show appreciation and admiration once again. Really excited to partner with you in a lot of things that we're gonna be accomplishing together at Very Good Ventures. And it's also really great to see you getting back with the community because probably like, there's a lot of people that will remember from the early days, and you've had a tremendous impact in how we do Dart and Flutter today. Like there's no question about it, right? So the more I can help you to get back to it and be visible, the better. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. We're behind the scenes, but we'll come back out of the shadows after I don't know, COVID. It was an odd time.
I
But yeah,
know.
thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. And yeah, had a blast as well. And we'll definitely catch up with some beers IRL. If you see us at conferences or anything, please come up and chat with us. Always happy to meet new peeps.
Sounds great. All right, listeners, we'll see you in the next episode of Very Good Engineering. Bye.